And the heresy we're examining today is that aid as it stands should be abandoned. And what would be the consequence of that if we did so? And let me introduce the panel. On my right is Thomas Dichter. He's worked in international development for almost half a century. He served as a senior consultant to the World Bank, for the United Nations, and numerous leading global NGOs. Hilary Benn was Secretary of State for International Development under Tony Blair and Minister for the Environment under Gordon Brown. Bronwen Maddox has been editor of Prospect magazine since 2010. Previously, she served as Washington bureau chief and US editor at The Times. And in 2008, she published the book In Defense of America. And on our left is Janne Teller, who's a Danish novelist translated into 25 languages and a former UN economist.
In my almost 50-year-long career in this business, I have been involved in over 60 countries in implementing and evaluating and designing literally hundreds of projects. Last year, by chance, I had a chance to visit a chicken production project in Africa that was the exact replica of the one I'd seen fail in Morocco 50 years earlier. Same stupid mistakes, same lack of homework, and the same assumption that we know what's best. A few months later, I was in a village in Zambia evaluating a water and sanitation project, and I spotted 2 rusted hand pumps, and I said, "What's the story here?" And they said, "Oh, those hand pumps, that's from Irish Aid around 2003. And what about this broken down pit latrine over here? Oh, that's, let's see, that's Save the Children, 1995 or so." And here we are, putting in new hand pumps and new pit latrines years later without paying any attention to the obvious archaeological evidence that those previous projects had failed. Now, why does this keep happening? And I can assure you that it does keep happening. There are many reasons. I'll go briefly into only 3 of them right here. The first is that foreign aid for development, and I'm talking about development, not about saving lives and not about humanitarian aid, but about development. Foreign aid for development has become largely about the delivery of money and things. And that delivery has been done far too rapidly, without enough homework, and with a tremendous amount of attention paid to checking off boxes on a matrix that we now, at least in the US, call the results framework. Did the community help dig the pit latrine? Check yes for community ownership. Was a local water users association formed? Check yes for sustainability. A second reason is that our established aid system, in my view, willfully ignores human nature. Most particularly the fact that generally people do not maintain things that they received for free. And more important, the third reason is that development aid, much of foreign aid, has become an industry. An industry whose main purpose in being is its own self-perpetuation. There are thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in the North, in the West, like myself, who are employed in this industry, and we don't want to lose our jobs. To justify that self-perpetuation, in my view and my experience, the aid industry has not been able to face its lessons. It has not been able to see all the things it ought to have learned over 50, 60 years. The principal one being that development is not about money and things. It is about institutional change and the complex interactions of political economy, social structure, and culture that inform those institutions. This level of complexity, the current aid establishment is not capable of taking on board. And so we're doomed, in my view, to continually get it wrong. Who can get it right? Well, at this point, after all these years, it has to be the countries themselves. It's really their responsibility. And our role in future, if we have one, and we can answer that question later, is certainly a diminished one, and we need to back off let go and work ourselves out of a job.
Look, Thomas, you've described some bad aid programs. I can think of one, a birthing suite that had been provided by a donor 25 years earlier in a little village in Ethiopia, and they'd left and thought, right, we've got some modern kit here. Had it ever been used to deliver a single baby? No. Why? Because there was no doctor, no midwife in that community. If you were giving birth and your baby got into difficulties, you depended on someone being able to put you on the back of a motorbike to travel to the nearest hospital. Now, that is not an argument against aid, that's an argument against doing things in the wrong way. So that's the first point I make. Secondly, does aid make a positive difference? Yes, it does. Because there are children in school today because of the support of other countries. There are children who are not dying of diseases that our children don't die of because of vaccination programs. There are people who would have died because they are HIV positive who are not currently dead because we developed antiretrovirals and we've provided a lot of finance. The Global Fund has raised a lot of finance to help countries. And look, I reflect on my experience. The first African country I ever went to was Malawi. And at that time, virtually no one was on antiretroviral drugs. That was in 2002. And the Vice President, Justin Malawesi, was asking, well, what could we do? Now, the prevailing development view at the time was no good thinking about antiretrovirals because until you get a health service in place, you can't deliver them. Actually, we were wrong, he was right. I changed our policy as the Development Secretary. When I went back in 2006, from memory, there are about 400,000 people alive on antiretroviral drugs, and aid has played a part in helping them. Now, the progress we can see, fewer kids not being in school, reduction in the proportion of people in the world living below the absolute poverty line, reduction in the rate of infection with malaria, is partly as a result of development within countries and partly a result of the assistance. And it's not, aid cannot be the answer, of course not. Because if aid was the answer, if you could write a large enough cheque, then you could solve the problems of development and poverty. That is not the case. Ultimately, and I agree with you on this, Thomas, it is about societies, countries developing themselves, and that is about the decisions you take for yourself. Not having a war is a really good idea if you want to develop. In my time, why did Sierra Leone and Afghanistan share the distinction of having the highest rates of infant mortality in the world? Well, in part because of the history of conflict, allied with lack of access to clean water and sanitation, which is the biggest killer of children under the age of 5, apart from the lack of care if they get into difficulty just after they have been born. It's about having the rule of law, good governance, good politics, accountable politicians. All of the things that I think our history teaches us help to make a difference. The less spectacular bits of aid, for instance, working to improve the ability of a finance ministry to actually shift the cash they've got in their budget, whether it's cash the country itself has been able to raise or budget support that's been given by donors, to actually get it out so it can get spent on employing doctors, nurses, buying drugs, building schools, buying tables and textbooks. That is less spectacular, but in the end, it will make a difference. People in country A say, show me how your aid is making a difference. I've paid the taxes. Actually, working together to cooperate, to give financial support to a ministry that wants more kids into school but lacks the cash is the more sensible thing to do. But it doesn't quite square with donor countries' desire to say, well, there goes the British pound. That's the vaccine it paid for. Oh, that's the kid that we are now supporting. So we have to work our way through that, and that is partly down to you. So it's about the right kind of aid in the right way. There are tensions, and I'm sure we'll discuss them, about accountability to donors, because in the end, politicians in any country should be accountable to their people, not to me when I was the International Development Secretary. It's not my job. Don't come and talk to me. Go give your own government a hard time, just as you managed to do to us here in the UK. And lastly, it's both a moral question for me. It's also about our self-interest, in the true sense of the word, not selfishness, because in the end, a world in which there's great gaps in poverty, equality and opportunity will not be a stable and secure world. And why do so many people get in leaky boats and some of them drown in order to try and get to Europe from the coast of North Africa, is because the life that they can see for themselves where they live at the moment isn't going to offer them something better, and they want to move, as human beings have always done, to somewhere else in the world where they can have a better life. And that is a really good argument for providing help to support people who in the end have to do it for themselves. Thank you.